All right, in these notes, we are going to look at evaluating functions. So functions are different types of equations. We've already studied a lot of functions throughout the years, and especially this year, this semester, as we've looked into Math 3. So you're going to see some functions here that you recognize that are familiar, because I put the ones specifically that you should be familiar with. So if you look at f of x, this is a function that is linear, y equals mx plus b form. Here's another function that is linear. I also put some quadratic functions in here. So we have an x squared function and another x squared function. We also have some cubic functions. So x to the third plus x is a cubic function. It's not written in such a way that you could get the locator point from it. This is not written in such a way that you could get the vertex from it, but they're still cubic and quadratic functions. Here we have a cube root function. Over here we've got a square root function. So functions aren't new to us. We've seen them before, but we may not always see them in this notation. So this notation just means that the function is in terms of x. This is a function of x, and that x is the variable that you can plug different values in for. And so if we are evaluating functions, then we're just practicing plugging numbers into the function, which is something that you guys have done before. It just might look a little different than what you're used to. So that's what we're going to be practicing today. The first time that you do this, especially when we get past the problems where they just have numbers plugging in, to where we're plugging in things with letters, where we're plugging expressions in, it might be a little bit easier to follow along with this and to do it yourself if you have a color to do this in. So I'm using a marker to plug my numbers in and to plug my expressions in, and I would recommend that maybe you grab something as well, just to make that a little bit easier for you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first problem. So it says f is the function that we're plugging it into. -4 is the number that we're going to be plugging in. So I'm going to go ahead and write down the function. I'm going to say f of x is 3x minus 8. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my marker to write down where I'm plugging in the -4. So -4 is written where the x is, and then the x is over here. So that is where I'm going to be plugging in my -4. And then what I like to do is I like to put parentheses where I'm going to be plugging it in, and I'll show you how I'm going to make that look. I'm just going to put parentheses around the x, and that's because sometimes we have to multiply things. Sometimes we might have two things getting plugged in, which you'll see down here. We've got two things getting plugged in, so we might have a negative that we need to distribute or something. So the parentheses are generally pretty helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and write down what I've got here. And now I'm going to take the x out, and I'm just going to leave the space for me to plug in that number. And if you don't like using the colors the way I'm using them, if you think that's annoying, that's totally fine. You can just use it as, you know, it's helpful to see it, but you don't have to write it yourself. So now I'm going to go back to where my parentheses are, and I'm going to plug in the number. Plugging in -4. So this part right here, f of -4, this is just me doing what the problem asked me to do. This is notation. This is not the math part of the problem. So I don't have to do any more with this. In fact, I'm going to cover it up with my finger. But this right here, this is what they were asking me to do. And so this is where I'm going to take my calculator, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to plug that in. So 3 times -4 minus 8. 3 times -4 minus 8. And be careful when you're typing something like this in that you're using the correct buttons. So you notice I said 3 times -4 minus 8. So I had to use both of those buttons on the problem. 3 times -4 minus 8, and that gives me -20. Okay, for the next one I've got g. G of x is -x squared plus 9x. So I'm going to write in the 2 spots, well, more than 2 spots, 3 spots, I guess, where the x's are. And I'm going to put parentheses around them. And notice I'm not ever putting the parentheses around anything else, just the x. Okay, so I have g of x equals negative x squared plus 9 times x. And the number that I'm plugging in for the x is negative 2. Now, this g of negative 2 over here, this is just notation. I don't really need it anymore. And so now I'm going to type everything in exactly the way that it's written. So I have negative of negative 2 squared plus 9 times negative 2. Just exactly the way that it's written. And I get negative 22. Okay, next one says k of 49. So k of x is 4 times the square root of x. And I'm going to go ahead and show where I'm plugging things in. So there's my parentheses. Now, this problem is kind of unique because I don't really need my parentheses there, but I'm still going to write them anyway to show you that it doesn't really matter. So the number that I'm plugging in for x is 49. So over here I have my notation. I don't really need that now, and I can go ahead and plug in my problem. So I've got 4, and then I need my square root sign. And I'm going to go ahead and use parentheses because the problem has parentheses, and your calculator can handle this just fine. There we go. So the answer is 28. All right, next. M of 64, so m of x, I'm writing the function down, and then I'm going to locate my x's. I'm going to see where I'm plugging the number in. And the number that I'm plugging in is 64. So I don't need this. This is just notation. I'm going to type in cube root of 64, subtract 9. So to get a cube root, I have to hit the math button. The cube root is number 4. So cube root of 64, subtract 9. Negative 5. Okay, now for the next set of problems, they're asking you not just to figure out what one number is, but to take 2 different numbers and then perform an operation with them. So take 2 different numbers, add them together, or subtract them, or multiply them, or whatever. So I'm going to find h of 8 first. Then I'm going to find n of negative 3, then I'm going to add them together. So h of x is 3x minus 2. So here's my x's. So I have h of x equals 3x minus 2, and I'm plugging in an 8. So 3 times 8 minus 2 is 22. Okay, n of negative 3, oops, I'm not plugging that in yet. I'm just writing n of x down. N of x is x to the third plus x. And the number that we're plugging in for n into the function n is negative 3. So I'm plugging negative 3 into the x. So this part here is just notation. And then I'm going to type in parenthesis negative 3 to the third plus negative 3. And I get negative 30. So the problem that I'm doing is 22 plus, oops, you can't even see it, 22 plus negative 30. So 22 plus negative 30 is negative 8. Okay, let's do the next one. So P of x is negative x squared plus x. And I'm plugging in negative 5. So we've got a negative 5 and a negative 5 and a negative 5. So if I plug in negative 5, then I have the negative version of negative 5 squared plus negative 5. Oops. So I'm typing it exactly the way it looks on my paper, and I get negative 30 there as well. Interesting. Okay. And now I need Q of 11. So Q of x equals x plus 1. And we are plugging in 11. So we have 11 plus 1, which is 12, yeah. So I'm going to add negative 30 plus 12. Negative 18. Okay, now once you've done enough of these, you might get to the point where you can say, all right, I don't need to use my marker to write on top of the x and put my parentheses. I can just leave a blank space where the x is. So that's what I'm going to do for the next problems. I'm going to say, I'm going to try this without marker. So let me get rid of that. So I'm going to say f of x is 3 times x minus 8. And I'm just going to leave a blank space instead of writing down what the x is. And then I know that I'm plugging in 4. Okay, so this is just notation. I'm going to ignore it. And then 3 times 4 minus 8. 3 times 4 minus 8 is positive 4. Okay, g of x for the next one. So I'm going to say g of x is negative x squared plus 9x. And the number that we're plugging in is 1. Plugging in 1, plugging in 1. So I'm going to have the negative version of 1 squared plus 9 times 1, and that gives me 8. And I have to multiply these together. So I'm going to get 4 multiplied by 8, which is 32. Okay, let's try that again. So this one we have h, function h. So I'm going to say h of x is 3 times x minus 2. And I'm taking h of x and I'm plugging in negative 1. So negative 1, negative 1. And this is just notation. And then I've got 3 times negative 1 minus 2. Negative 5. Okay. K of 4, so I'm going to use k of x. K of x is 4 times the square root of x. And I'm plugging into k the number 4. So in the calculator, I'm going to have 4 times the square root of 4, which is 8. So I'm going to have the fraction where negative 5 is on the top and 8 is on the bottom. Okay, now we're getting to the ones that are going to take us a little bit more energy, because these ones cannot be plugged into a calculator because they have variables in them. So next we have m. So I'm going to start off by just writing m out. M of x is the cube root of x minus 9, okay? And then the thing that I want to plug in is 27b to the third. 27b to the third. Okay, so I don't need this part. This is just notation. It was telling me what I was plugging in. Now I need to look at what I plugged in and see what happens. I don't really need those parentheses. If they're going to confuse you at this point, you could erase them. Plugging them into my calculator is one thing, but looking at it on my paper right now, I don't really like them there. Okay, so now I want to see what's the cube root of 27. The cube root of 27, and that sounds familiar to me, so I'm just going to double check. The cube root of 27, well, 27 is a perfect cube, so the cube root of 27 is just 3. So I have the cube root of 27, and then I have the cube root of b to the third. So b to the third and then the cube root of that, those two operations cancel each other out. If you do something to the third power and then you cube root it, it cancels out. So this is just 3b all by itself. And then I'll drop down the negative 9. So 3b minus 9. And I think I did that a couple times on the worksheet. I gave things to plug in where you could put them in for a square root or a cube root, and the root would simplify them. Okay, for the next one, f of x, so I'm going to write f of x, and I'm going to make the space kind of big because we're plugging in two things this time. F of x is 3x minus 8. F of x is 3x minus 8. And the thing that we're plugging in for x is a minus 6. A minus 6. So I'm going to get rid of this part. I don't really need it because it's just notation. But I do need this part. I'm going to take the number in front and I'm going to multiply it by what's inside the parentheses. So I'm distributing 3a minus 18 minus 8. And now I can go ahead and combine like terms. So 3a minus 26. And that is my final answer. Okay. Next one, we have g. So g of x is negative x squared plus 9 times x. And the thing that we're plugging in for x is 4c. 4c, 4c. So I don't need this part. This is just my notation, so I'm going to ignore it. This says negative, the negative version of 4c squared. So the negative version of 4c multiplied by itself. The negative version of 4c times 4c. Okay, plus 9 times 4c. Okay, so now I can go ahead and I can do this multiplication. 4c times 4c is just 16c squared, and it has a negative in front of it, so I'm going to keep the negative. And then 9 times 4c is 36c. And so that is my final answer. All right, on to the last problem. We have function p. P of x, again, I'm leaving a big space because I have two things to plug in. P of x is negative. I do not have room for this. Hold on, I'm going to back up here. Maybe write a little bit smaller. Okay, P of x is negative x squared plus x. There we go. And the thing that we're plugging in for x is a plus 7, a plus 7, a plus 7. Okay, so this beginning part is notation. And then this says we're going to have the negative version of a plus 7 multiplied by itself. That's what squared means, so there's two of them, plus a plus 7. So I have the negative version of a plus 7 multiplied by itself plus a plus 7. Now this a plus 7 over here on the end, it's not being multiplied by anything. There's not a number right in front of the parentheses to distribute. So these parentheses aren't really necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and erase them. They were helpful for plugging the a plus 7 in, but other than that, I don't really need them. Okay, so there they are. All right, now I'm going to hold on to this negative, and I'm going to go ahead and multiply a plus 7 times a plus 7. I'm going to FOIL it out. So a times a is, I'm going to leave the negative out here. A times a is a squared. A times 7 is 7a. 7 times a is also 7a. And then 7 times 7 is 49. Okay. So if I put these two together, those are actually 14. 14a. Okay. Plus a plus 7. So now I can go ahead and I can take my negative and I can make my negative apply to everything in the parentheses. So I have negative a squared minus 14a minus 49, but I still have the plus a and the plus 7. So my final answer is negative a squared minus 13a minus 42. Whew. All right, that was a lot.